Texas has long been celebrated as the energy capital of America, a state that powers industries, fuels economies, and lights up 25 million homes. The Lone Star State built its reputation on independence, energy independence, an entire power grid deliberately cut off from the rest of the nation. But in February 2021, that independence became a death sentence. Not because of an unprecedented storm, not because of unforeseeable disaster, but because politicians chose ideology over infrastructure. They ignored 10 years of federal warnings. They dismantled oversight to protect corporate profits, and they let 246 Texans freeze to death in their own homes. The economic damage reached nearly $200 billion. 4.5 million households lost power for days. Electricity bills exploded to $17,000 per family. And the politicians responsible? They blamed windmills. They blamed liberals. They blamed everyone except themselves. This was not an accident. This was political negligence. A state that gambled its citizens' lives to avoid federal regulation. And the worst part? The grid still is not fixed. It will happen again. The collapse of the Texas power grid did not begin in February 2021. It began exactly 10 years earlier. In 2011, another winter storm swept across the state. Temperatures plunged. Power plants froze. 3.2 million Texans lost electricity. The blackouts lasted days. Within months, federal investigators delivered their verdict. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the North American Electric Reliability Corporation issued a comprehensive report. The findings were damning. Power generators had failed to winterize their equipment. Natural gas pipelines froze solid. Coal plants seized up in the cold. Wind turbines locked with ice. The report contains specific recommendations. Install heating elements around critical pipes and instruments. Insulate vulnerable equipment against freezing temperatures. Create mandatory weatherization standards for all power generators. Establish emergency fuel reserves before winter storms arrive. These were not suggestions. They were warnings based on identical failures from 1989. Federal regulators pointed out that the same equipment failures had occurred 22 years earlier. The same pipes froze. The same generators failed. The same Texans lost power. What did Texas do with these warnings? Absolutely nothing. The state legislature considered a bill requiring mandatory weatherization. Senate Bill 1133 would have forced power companies to protect their equipment. But before the bill passed, the weatherization mandate was removed. Industry lobbyists convinced lawmakers that mandatory standards were too expensive, too burdensome, too intrusive. What remained was a requirement for power companies to submit annual reports. Just paperwork, no enforcement, no inspections, no consequences for failure. One Texas state senator later called these reports exactly what they were: book reports, meaningless documents that gathered dust while the grid remained vulnerable. The Electric Reliability Council of Texas admitted it had no authority to enforce weatherization. The Public Utility Commission had eliminated its oversight division. The Texas Railroad Commission, responsible for natural gas infrastructure, conducted virtually no inspections. Federal regulators watched in frustration. They had identified every failure point. They had prescribed every solution. And Texas politicians deliberately chose to ignore them. Stick around. Because what happened next proves this was not incompetence. It was a calculated decision to sacrifice safety for profit. Understanding why Texas ignored federal warnings requires understanding why Texas operates its own power grid in the first place. The answer reveals everything about the state's political priorities. During World War II, Texas power companies linked their networks together to support defense industries. After the war, they kept these connections intact. By 1967, the companies merged into a single system called the Texas Interconnected System. But in 1935, Congress had passed the Federal Power Act. Any utility that transmitted electricity across state lines fell under federal jurisdiction. Federal regulators could set standards, require weatherization, mandate reserve capacity, hold companies accountable for failures. Texas power companies wanted none of that oversight, so they made a deliberate choice. They would keep their grid entirely within state borders. No interstate connections meant no federal regulation. This decision reflected broader Texas political culture. State leaders prided themselves on independence from Washington. They viewed federal regulation as government interference in free markets. They believed private industry could manage electricity better than government bureaucrats. The deregulation that followed in 1999 deepened these convictions. Texas broke up its integrated utilities into separate generation, transmission, and retail companies. Competition would supposedly drive down prices and improve service. Residential electricity rates had been significantly below the national average before deregulation. After deregulation, rates increased 64% between 1999 and 2007. The promise of cheaper power through competition never materialized for most consumers. But the ideology persisted. Politicians who championed deregulation won elections. Campaign contributions flowed from energy companies benefiting from minimal oversight. The arrangement served industry profits even as it failed consumers. In 1970, utilities formed the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. ERCOT would manage the isolated grid. The state's Public Utility Commission would provide the only oversight. Federal regulators had no authority. This arrangement faced a legal challenge in 1976. A Texas utility secretly connected its grid to Oklahoma for several hours in an event called the Midnight Connection. The company hoped to trigger federal jurisdiction over the entire Texas system. The legal battle lasted years. Texas power companies fought desperately to maintain their isolation. In the end, they won. A compromise protected ERCOT from federal regulation, as long as most connections remained within state borders. ERCOT officials celebrated this independence openly. The agency produced promotional videos championing freedom from federal oversight. Industry executives praised the arrangement as a competitive advantage, but isolation came with catastrophic risks. When disasters struck other states, utilities could import emergency power from neighboring grids. Texas could not. The few existing connections to neighboring states provided only 1,200 megawatts, enough to power just 300,000 homes during peak demand. Federal regulators repeatedly warned that this isolation created dangerous vulnerabilities. They recommended building more interstate connections. They suggested establishing emergency power sharing agreements. They urged Texas to join the national grid system. Texas politicians rejected every recommendation. They called federal oversight government intrusion. They claimed joining the national grid would raise electricity prices. They insisted Texas could handle any emergency alone. What state do you live in? Drop it below, because what happened to Texas could happen anywhere. Politicians prioritize ideology over infrastructure. The perfect storm meets unprepared infrastructure. On February 7, 2021, meteorologists at the National Weather Service began warning Texas officials about an incoming winter storm. By February 13th, all 254 Texas counties were under winter storm watch. Governor Greg Abbott issued a disaster declaration that same day. State officials assured residents that the power grid was prepared. ERCOT executives promised adequate reserves. The Public Utility Commission expressed confidence. Behind the scenes, reality was already unraveling. On February 14th, temperatures plummeted across the state. Demand for electricity shattered all previous records. Texans turned up heaters. Businesses cranked up climate systems. Hospitals maxed out their power consumption. The grid needed nearly 70,000 megawatts of capacity. It was the highest winter demand in state history, more than 12,000 megawatts above existing capacity. Then the generators started failing. Natural gas wells froze across West Texas. Pipelines seized up as moisture in the gas turned to ice. Compressor stations lost power and shut down. Within hours, gas supplies to power plants dropped catastrophically. Coal piles froze solid at generating stations. Conveyors jammed with ice. Sensors malfunctioned in the cold. Equipment that had never been winterized failed exactly as federal regulators predicted 10 years earlier. Wind turbines locked up as ice accumulated on their blades. But contrary to what Governor Abbott would later claim, wind power was not the primary failure. Natural gas outages accounted for 5 times more lost capacity than wind turbines. By February 15th at 1:25 in the morning, ERCOT issued emergency declarations. The grid was collapsing faster than operators could respond. Within 4 hours, 40% of total generating capacity went offline. Over 52,000 megawatts disappeared from the system. ERCOT ordered controlled blackouts to prevent complete grid failure. What they called rolling outages were supposed to last 45 minutes per area. Instead, millions of Texans lost power for days. At the darkest moment, the grid came within 4 minutes and 37 seconds of total collapse. A complete blackout would have destroyed transformers and substations across the state. Recovery would have taken weeks or months, not days, but the damage that did occur was devastating enough. More than 4.5 million homes and businesses lost power. Average outages lasted 42 consecutive hours. Some neighborhoods went dark for 4 days straight. Indoor temperatures dropped below freezing inside homes without heat. Pipes burst in millions of residences. Water systems failed across entire cities. Hospitals lost power and scrambled to evacuate patients. The death toll began climbing immediately. People froze to death in their beds. Carbon monoxide poisoning killed families running cars in their garages for warmth. House fires erupted as desperate residents used candles and space heaters. Medical equipment failed without electricity. State health officials eventually attributed 210 deaths directly to the storm. Independent investigations suggested the true toll exceeded 700. The economic devastation was staggering. Property damage alone reached nearly $200 billion. Lost business activity cost billions more. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas estimated total financial losses between $80 billion and $130 billion. What made this catastrophe uniquely cruel was how preventable it was. Every single failure point had been identified 10 years earlier. Every solution had been prescribed. Texas politicians simply chose not to implement them. Ever noticed how states keep suffering the same disasters, but never fix the real problems? This is what happens when politicians serve donors instead of citizens. As millions of Texans shivered in darkness, another disaster was unfolding in their bank accounts. The same deregulated market that politicians celebrated was about to devastate family finances. During normal conditions, wholesale electricity in Texas costs around $35 per megawatt hour. The seasonal average sits near $50. These prices keep electricity affordable for most consumers. But the Texas system included a catastrophic design flaw. When demand exceeded supply, the Public Utility Commission could raise wholesale prices to encourage generators to produce more power. The maximum allowed price was $9,000 per megawatt hour. On February 16th, regulators triggered that maximum. Wholesale electricity prices exploded to 257 times normal levels, and regulators kept prices at the maximum for nearly 2 days after the emergency ended. Most Texans never saw these wholesale prices directly. Fixed-rate plans protected them from immediate impact, but some consumers had chosen variable rate plans that passed wholesale costs straight to their bills. One company called Griddy exemplified the disaster. For $9.99 monthly, customers could access wholesale electricity prices. During normal times, this saved money. During the storm, it destroyed lives. DeAndre Upshaw in Dallas received a bill for nearly $7,000. Katrina Tanner faced charges of $6,225. Lisa Corey in Chambers County was charged $9,546. Some customers reported bills exceeding $17,000. Griddy automatically debited these charges from customer bank accounts. Families woke up to discover their accounts emptied. Credit cards maxed out, checks bouncing. Financial devastation compounding the physical misery of freezing homes. One family in Rockwall paid $7,300 for electricity during a week when they mostly had no power. They watched Griddy drain their accounts while they huddled in the cold. The company later claimed it did not profit from the crisis. It blamed ERCOT for keeping prices artificially high. It blamed the Public Utility Commission for allowing such extreme price caps. But customers trapped in financial ruin found little comfort in corporate finger-pointing. Independent monitors later determined that ERCOT had overcharged power companies by $16 billion during the storm. The grid operator kept prices at maximum rates for nearly 2 days after conditions no longer justified them. Brazos Electric Power Cooperative, which served more than 1.5 million Texans, accumulated $2.1 billion in charges during the storm. The cooperative filed for bankruptcy within weeks. Just Energy Group also sought bankruptcy protection. Griddy followed in March, owing between $10 million and $50 million to creditors. The company's collapse left 24,000 customers, with outstanding bills totaling $29 million. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton eventually sued Griddy for deceptive trade practices. The company settled by agreeing to forgive unpaid customer bills through bankruptcy. But families who had already paid received little relief. Class action lawsuits multiplied. Wrongful death claims piled up. Personal injury cases flooded courts. Property damage suits named ERCOT, utilities, and power generators as defendants. The Texas Supreme Court eventually ruled that ERCOT could not be sued due to sovereign immunity. The entity responsible for managing the grid that killed hundreds of Texans faced no legal accountability. The human toll extended far beyond electricity bills. 31% of Texans experienced water damage to their homes from burst pipes. Only 18% believed insurance would cover their losses. 3/4 of residents reported difficulty finding food and groceries during the crisis. Families who lost loved ones faced impossible choices. Elderly parents died in freezing homes, while adult children could not reach them through impassable roads. Children watched parents succumb to hypothermia while waiting for help that never arrived. Medical patients dependent on powered equipment faced life-threatening emergencies as batteries drained. The Wall Street Journal later calculated that Texas consumers had paid $28 billion more for electricity since deregulation than they would have under traditional regulation. The promise of cheaper power through competition had proven catastrophically false. This was the true cost of deregulation. A market designed to maximize profits transferred all risk to consumers. When the system failed, families paid with their lives and their savings, while corporations hid behind legal protections. Even as Texans died and billions in damage accumulated, state politicians launched a coordinated campaign of deflection. Rather than accepting responsibility for a decade of neglected warnings, they blamed everything except their own choices. Governor Greg Abbott appeared on Fox News and blamed frozen wind turbines for the blackouts. He claimed the Green New Deal would be deadly for Texas. He suggested that renewable energy had failed the state. The claim was demonstrably false. Wind power typically provides about 10% of Texas winter electricity. Natural gas provides the overwhelming majority. When federal investigators examined the data, they found natural gas failures caused 5 times more lost capacity than wind turbines. But the narrative served political purposes. Blaming renewable energy deflected attention from the real culprit, the fossil fuel industry that had lobbied against weatherization requirements for decades. The politicians who had dismantled oversight to please campaign donors. ERCOT President Bill Magnus was asked directly about the 2011 federal report. He claimed he did not know which report investigators were referencing. The agency tasked with grid reliability apparently had no institutional memory of warnings that predicted exactly what happened. Internal documents told a different story. Leaked memos showed state officials understood the risks. Regional tourism boards projected economic devastation. Energy Department analysts warned of potential grid collapse. The Public Utility Commission had eliminated its Oversight and Enforcement Division just months before the storm. They had severed ties with the Texas Reliability Entity, the independent monitor of grid reliability. These decisions weakened enforcement of the voluntary weatherization guidelines that few generators followed anyway. After the storm, PUC Chairwoman Deanne Walker resigned. ERCOT's board fired Bill Magnus. 4 board directors stepped down amid outrage that they lived outside Texas. The commissioner Abbott appointed to replace Walker lasted weeks before he too resigned. The Texas legislature held hearings. Politicians expressed shock at failures they had enabled for years. They demanded answers from officials they had appointed. They promised reforms they had rejected repeatedly since 2011. Senate Bill 3 eventually passed, requiring weatherization of power plants and natural gas facilities. The legislation gave regulators authority to levy fines for non-compliance. It directed ERCOT to conduct weather studies and improve emergency protocols. But critics noted the law contained familiar weaknesses. Enforcement timelines stretched years into the future. Natural gas weatherization requirements remained vague. The Railroad Commission, historically friendly to oil and gas interests, retained oversight of pipelines. Most importantly, no legislation addressed the fundamental vulnerability. Texas remained isolated from national power grids. When the next disaster struck, the state would face it alone. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission Chairman Richard Glick expressed frustration publicly. He noted that Texas had cut off its nose to spite its face by avoiding federal regulation. He promised that this time, federal recommendations would not be ignored or watered down. Glick was blunt about the unnecessary nature of the catastrophe. People froze to death because of power outages, he said. That is beyond unacceptable. The worst part was that it was avoidable. Federal investigators found that 87% of all fuel-related power plant failures stemmed from natural gas supply problems. The industry that politicians protected most aggressively bore the greatest responsibility for the disaster. Commissioner Mark Christie suggested the root cause was even simpler. In an energy-only market, no one has an obligation to serve electricity. The deregulated Texas system incentivized cheap power production over reliable power production. Companies made money by cutting costs, not by maintaining reserves. When prices spiked during emergencies, generators could earn fortunes in hours. But those same generators faced no penalties for failing to prepare. The market rewarded risk-taking and punished prudence. But FERC had limited authority over ERCOT. Without interstate connections, the agency could not mandate Texas compliance. Politicians who had deliberately isolated the grid to avoid federal oversight now face the consequences of that isolation. You will not believe what the next investigation revealed about why the grid is still vulnerable today. 4 years after Winter Storm Uri killed hundreds and caused nearly $200 billion in damage, investigations reveal a disturbing truth. The reforms politicians promised have largely failed to protect Texans. In August 2025, the Texas State Auditor released a damning report on natural gas weatherization. The findings echoed everything federal investigators warned about in 2011. State oil and gas inspectors were not adequately verifying that natural gas facilities could operate during severe winter storms. The Railroad Commission, responsible for overseeing pipelines and wells, had conducted over 8,000 inspections during the 2024 and 2025 winter seasons. They issued exactly 2 violations. Both violations were for facilities that had done absolutely nothing to prepare for winter. Every other facility passed inspection regardless of their actual weatherization measures. The audit revealed a fundamental problem. Current rules allow gas companies to decide for themselves what constitutes sufficient winter preparedness. Inspectors were not comparing actual weatherization methods to industry best practices. They were simply accepting whatever companies claimed they had done. When facilities passed inspection, the Railroad Commission did not follow up with suggestions for improvement. There was no verification that staff had attended safety training. The Commission admitted it relied on facility operators to determine their own weatherization needs. Watchdog groups called the findings predictable. The Railroad Commission had long demonstrated friendliness to the industries it supposedly regulated. Commissioners were elected with massive contributions from oil and gas companies. Oversight served industry interests, not public safety. 26% of natural gas facilities failed winter readiness audits in 2024. Gas production still drops 18 to 22% during extreme cold weather. That represents only marginal improvement from 2021, when production collapsed by 50%. During a January 2025 cold snap, ERCOT narrowly avoided blackouts when gas-fired power plants underperformed by 4.3 gigawatts. Emergency battery discharges saved the grid from another catastrophic failure. Federal regulators continued warning that Texas's self-certification system for generator weatherization remained insufficiently rigorous. The same voluntary approach that failed in 2011 and 2021 still governed most grid preparation. The state had added significant new power capacity since the crisis. Solar installations expanded from 12.9 gigawatts to 19.6 gigawatts. Wind generation continued providing over 20% of state electricity. Battery storage grew from 2 gigawatts to 11 gigawatts. These additions helped meet growing demand. Population growth and new data centers were pushing electricity consumption higher every year. ERCOT projected demand could reach 97 gigawatts during future severe weather events. But new capacity did not address underlying vulnerabilities. Natural gas remained the backbone of Texas electricity. When gas supplies failed during cold weather, all the solar panels and wind turbines in the state could not compensate. The fundamental problem remained unsolved. Texas still operated an isolated grid. Politicians still rejected federal oversight. The market structure still prioritized cheap power over reliable power. And regulators still allowed industry to police itself. The reforms that followed Winter Storm Uri represented the minimum politicians could pass while claiming action. They created the appearance of response without addressing the ideological choices that made disaster inevitable. The most devastating reality about the Texas power grid is not what happened in February 2021. It is what will happen again. The conditions that caused 246 deaths and $200 billion in damage remain fundamentally unchanged. Climate scientists warn that severe winter storms are becoming more frequent, not less. The polar vortex that pushed Arctic air into Texas will destabilize again. When it does, the same infrastructure failures will repeat. ERCOT's own forecasts project potential power shortfalls beginning in summer 2028. Demand growth from data centers, cryptocurrency mining, and population increases is outpacing new generation. The grid that nearly collapsed during unexpected cold faces chronic shortage even during normal conditions. The state's isolation compounds every vulnerability. When California faces power emergencies, it imports electricity from neighboring states. When Texas faces emergencies, it has virtually nowhere to turn. The 1,200 megawatts of interstate connections cannot power more than a fraction of state needs. Federal regulators have proposed solutions. Build more connections to neighboring grids. Submit to federal oversight in exchange for emergency access. Establish regional power-sharing agreements for disasters. Texas politicians have rejected every proposal. State leaders continue championing grid independence as a competitive advantage. They dismiss federal regulation as government overreach. They insist Texas can handle any emergency alone. The evidence proves otherwise. The 2021 collapse demonstrated exactly what happens when ideology overrides engineering. When political convenience trumps safety planning. When campaign donors matter more than constituent lives. Consumer advocates warn that another crisis could be even more devastating. The population has grown since 2021. More families depend on electricity for heating, medical equipment, and basic survival. More businesses operate facilities that cannot tolerate extended outages. The cost of future failure would be measured in more than dollars. It would be measured in lives lost, families destroyed, communities devastated. Entire regions plunged into chaos, and every Texan knows it is coming. Surveys show residents remain deeply skeptical that politicians will protect them. Majorities believe current laws and regulations are insufficient. Most do not trust state leaders to adequately address grid vulnerabilities. Some families have responded by installing solar panels and backup generators. They are preparing to survive independently when the grid fails again. But these solutions remain expensive. Millions of low-income Texans cannot afford private backup systems. The burden of political failure falls heaviest on those least able to protect themselves. The elderly who cannot evacuate. The disabled who depend on powered medical equipment. The poor who cannot afford alternative heating. These are the people Texas politicians abandoned when they chose deregulation over safety. These are the people who will suffer when the next collapse comes. And these are the people who deserved better from leaders sworn to protect them. The Texas power grid catastrophe is not merely a state tragedy. It is a warning for every American about what happens when infrastructure becomes hostage to ideology. In 2024, foreign visitors contributed over $213 billion to the United States economy. International tourism supported nearly 1.7 million American jobs. Energy infrastructure supported even more. Manufacturing, agriculture, technology, and healthcare all depend on reliable electricity. When Texas lost power for days, the economic ripple effects spread nationwide. Supply chains disrupted, products delayed, services interrupted. The second largest state economy in America effectively shut down. Other states face similar vulnerabilities. Arizona relies heavily on air conditioning during summer heat waves. California depends on complex water and power systems. Florida faces hurricane threats that strain infrastructure every year. The Texas model of isolated infrastructure and minimal regulation has attracted imitators. Politicians in other states have proposed similar deregulation schemes. They promise lower prices and freedom from federal oversight. They rarely mention the catastrophic risks. What Texas proved is that deregulation transfers risk from corporations to consumers. When systems function normally, companies profit from lower costs. When systems fail catastrophically, families pay with their lives and savings. The political calculus that produced the Texas disaster exists everywhere. Campaign donations from energy companies, lobbying against safety regulations, ideological opposition to federal oversight, short-term thinking that ignores long-term consequences. Every state with aging infrastructure and growing demand faces similar choices. They can invest in resilience now or pay catastrophically later. They can accept reasonable oversight or risk devastating failure. They can learn from Texas or repeat its mistakes. The climate changes making severe weather more frequent will not respect state borders. The infrastructure systems connecting American communities will face increasing stress. The political decisions made today will determine whether future disasters kill dozens or hundreds or thousands. Texas politicians gambled with their constituents' lives and lost. The question is whether other states will learn from that loss or place the same deadly bet. The infrastructure choices made in state capitals today will determine who lives and who dies during tomorrow's emergencies. These are not abstract policy debates. They are life and death decisions disguised as budget items. The power grid that killed 246 Texans is still not fixed. The politicians who ignored warnings still hold office. The corporations that profited from deregulation still operate without meaningful accountability. And somewhere in Texas tonight, a family is hoping the next winter storm is not as bad as the last one. They are hoping the politicians finally did something. They are hoping the grid holds together. They are hoping, because hope is all they have left. Subscribe now, and if you are watching on TV, tap your remote so you never get blindsided again.